The hall was packed. Journalists, world leaders, and security personnel stood shoulder to shoulder. The annual Global Leadership Forum in Geneva had never felt so tense. Two names dominated every conversation: Donald Trump and Ibrahim Traoré. No one expected them to speak on the same stage, not even the organizers. Trump had arrived earlier, surrounded by cameras, flashing smiles, and dominating every room like a seasoned performer. He joked, he gestured, he commanded. Then Traoré walked in. No entourage, no theatrics. Just calm, piercing eyes and a quiet confidence that filled the space more loudly than applause ever could. The audience didn't know how to react. Many had only seen him on African news outlets. But there was something different about him, something still, something unshakable. The moderator tried to keep the session light, but it was clear. Traoré had come with a purpose. As the floor opened for dialogue, the moderator turned to Traoré and asked gently, "President Traoré, do you have a question for Mr. Trump?" He didn't respond at first. He looked at Trump, then at the audience. The silence dragged on for just a second too long. Then he asked one single question, and in that moment, Trump didn't say a word. "What does freedom mean?" Traoré asked, his voice calm but unwavering. "When it only exists for those who can afford it." Trump blinked. The room tensed. Everyone had expected a political jab, a diplomatic dance, but not this. The question cut through the air like a blade, not directed only at Trump, but at the world watching, at centuries of inequality, at every leader who had turned away from suffering simply because it wasn't profitable. Trump shifted in his seat, lips parted, but nothing came out. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists froze mid-scribble. An aide whispered something into Trump's ear, but he waved them off. Traoré didn't look away. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dramatic. He was simply present, like a man who had carried too many funerals on his back, like someone who had buried children he didn't know but felt responsible for. "Because in Burkina Faso," he continued softly, "we have mothers who walk 40 miles for clean water. Children who study under the moonlight because they dream of a better world. So I ask again, what does freedom mean if it doesn't reach them too?" A woman in the audience began to cry. Trump still hadn't answered. Far away from Geneva, in a small village in Burkina Faso, a boy named Koudougou adjusted his wooden sandals carved from scraps by his grandfather. He had no electricity, no running water, but he carried his school books like treasure. This boy, who had never seen a real television, watched Ibrahim Traoré once, speaking in the village square. His mother cried that day. "Why are you crying, Mama?" he had asked. "Because someone is finally speaking for us," she replied. Now, as Traoré stood before world leaders in Geneva, he wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso. He was speaking for Koudougou, for the barefoot girls who shared pencils, for the farmers who had never owned the land they tilled, for the miners who dug up gold that never stayed. And that's what made Trump's silence so loud. It wasn't about politics. It was about being seen, about being heard after centuries of being invisible. Traoré's voice carried not just truth, but the weight of the forgotten. That night, the video of his question went viral. Millions shared it. Millions cried. But Koudougou didn't know any of that. He just walked 5 miles to school the next morning, still wearing his wooden shoes. The press conference ended early. Trump left the stage without saying a word, a rare sight for a man known for dominating headlines. Some said he looked pale. Others swore he looked reflective. That night, every major news outlet ran the same clip. What does freedom mean if it only exists for those who can afford it? Some anchors choked up while reading it. But what shocked the world most wasn't Traoré's question. It was Trump's complete silence. No rebuttal, no counterpunch. Just Silence. In the White House press room, even former officials avoided answering. But halfway across the world, in a village that had never heard of Fox News or CNN, a group of elders gathered around a radio powered by solar batteries. The interpreter spoke slowly, translating every word from Geneva. When Traoré's question was translated, the room went quiet. An old woman placed her hand over her heart. "It's like he was reading my thoughts," she whispered. "No," the chief replied. "He was reading our history." And still, Trump hadn't said a single word. The question was no longer his to answer. It belonged to the world now. 2 days after the forum, Traoré returned to his modest residence in Ouagadougou. No motorcade, no parades, just a man who knew he'd stirred something powerful. That night, one of his aides knocked gently. "Mr. President, this came for you." It was a letter, handwritten, no return address. Traoré opened it slowly. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were strong. "I watched you stand before the world and say what no one else dared. My name is Elijah. I served in the U.S. Army for 16 years. I believed I was defending freedom. But then I saw children crying over empty water bottles in Niger. I saw more money spent on bullets than on books. I thought I had failed. But when I heard your question, I cried. For the first time in years, I cried. Because someone finally asked what I never could. Thank you. You spoke for me." Traoré read the letter twice, then a third time. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You haven't failed. You were just never heard." Later that night, Traoré sat alone in his office. No advisors, no cameras, only the letter and his memories. He remembered the child he once was, walking through the dry red dust of his village barefoot, carrying a book too torn to read properly. His mother's hands were always blistered from pounding grain. His father walked miles each week to find clean water. Back then, he didn't understand poverty. He just called it normal. Now he had stood before the world, not as a politician, but as a boy who remembered what it felt like to go to sleep hungry, who remembered hiding from soldiers, who remembered praying that one day someone would ask why. That night, he wept. Not because he was sad, but because for the first time, a leader from the West had listened, even if silently, even if only for a moment. And he knew something had shifted, not just in a conference hall in Geneva, but in the hearts of millions. And far away, a retired U.S. soldier named Elijah also cried, because in Traoré's voice, he had finally heard his own. The morning after Traoré returned from Geneva, his office phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls came from across the globe, some from African youth movements, some from European journalists, and a few from inside the U.S. Congress. But one call stood out. It was from a woman in Chicago named Ruth Morrison, 84 years old, a civil rights activist who marched with Dr. King. Her voice shook with age and memory. "Mr. Traoré," she said, "I've waited 60 years to hear a black man speak like that on a global stage. You didn't just speak for Burkina Faso. You spoke for every voice that was ever silenced in the name of freedom." Traoré listened quietly, tears forming again. Ruth continued, "My grandson asked me why I was crying. I told him because somewhere across the ocean, a man remembered us." After the call ended, Traoré stood by the window for a long time. Below, in the dusty streets, children played with tires and sticks, laughing. They didn't know it yet. But the world had begun to tilt in their direction. 3 days later, a courier arrived at the Burkinabe presidential compound with a sealed envelope. It had no official markings, no flags, just a plain card with the U.S. seal at the bottom. Inside there was a handwritten note. The signature read, "Donald J. Trump." President Traoré, you caught me off guard. I'm not a man who's often left speechless. But when you asked that question, I saw my son's eyes. And then I thought of a village I once visited in Kenya in the 80s. I shook hands with children who smiled at me even though they had nothing. That memory came back when you spoke. I didn't know how to respond. Maybe I still don't. I've made decisions in the past that I thought were for the good of my country. But I realize now, we never asked what freedom costs the rest of the world. You asked that, and I respect it. No one else ever saw that letter. Traoré folded it quietly, placed it inside the drawer beside Elijah's note, and locked it. He didn't need applause. He only needed that moment to be real. In Paris, inside a high-rise news studio, journalist Amélie Blanche reviewed the footage again. She was known for her hardline political analysis, unshaken by war zones, scandals, or global crises. But this time, something broke through. As she replayed Traoré's voice saying, "What does freedom mean if it only exists for those who can afford it?" Her hand went still on the mouse. Her voice cracked on air. "I've interviewed refugees who lost everything. I've watched nations fall. But never in my career have I seen a man speak truth so simply and make the most powerful man in the world go completely silent." She didn't know why, but her eyes welled up. During the commercial break, she walked off set and collapsed in the hallway. A camera assistant found her, shaking, weeping into her hands. "It's like..." "He finally said what we were all too afraid to admit," she whispered. That night, France's most-watched news program didn't run its regular commentary. Instead, they aired a full replay of Traoré's speech. No edits, no filters, just truth. And across Europe, millions of viewers sat in front of their TVs, crying. In a small school in Baltimore, a young boy named Malik stood up during social studies class. His teacher had just played Traoré's Geneva speech as part of a lesson on modern world leaders. Malik was only 11, but when the video ended and silence filled the room, he slowly raised his hand. "Why didn't anyone ever ask that question before?" he said. "Is it because we were scared, or because we didn't care?" The teacher couldn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't know. Later that evening, Malik went home and wrote a letter. "Dear Mr. Traoré, I saw your video in school. You asked something that made all the grown-ups stop talking. I think that means you said something true. One day I want to ask questions like you do. Not to be famous, but to help people feel seen. Please don't stop talking. People are listening now." His mother found the letter on the kitchen table. She didn't change a word. She just folded it gently, kissed her son's forehead, and mailed it herself. In a remote corner of Mali, just past the border with Burkina Faso, a woman named Aissatou rocked her sick daughter to sleep. The baby's fever was rising. There were no clinics nearby. No ambulance would come. Aissatou hadn't slept in 2 nights. That evening, a local aid worker stopped by and played a downloaded radio broadcast. It was Traoré's Geneva speech, translated into Bambara. As she listened, Aissatou clutched her daughter tighter. She didn't understand politics, but she understood truth. When Traoré described women walking miles for water, she nodded without realizing it. When he spoke of freedom being meaningless if it didn't reach African villages, she whispered, "Yes." And when he said, "We are not asking for pity. We are asking for fairness," she cried. Not loud, but deeply. That night, for the first time in weeks, Aissatou fell asleep beside her child. Not because the fever had broken, but because someone powerful had spoken her pain aloud. She felt less alone. She didn't know who Donald Trump was, but she knew Ibrahim Traoré, and that was enough. In a quiet graveyard outside Atlanta, a folded American flag rested on a wooden bench. Elijah, the retired soldier who had written to Traoré, was being laid to rest. Only a few attended. No national ceremony, no parade. Just his daughter, two friends from the local VFW, and a folded copy of Traoré's speech printed on weathered paper. His daughter, Vanessa, held the page tight in her hands as she stood by his casket. "My father served with pride," she said, "but he carried guilt. He saw pain and never felt he could fix it. But then, one man, a man from far away, from a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, gave him peace in his final days." She unfolded Elijah's last letter. It ended with the words, "Maybe I wasn't fighting for freedom, but I'm glad someone still is." Vanessa placed the letter beside the casket and whispered, "You're free now, Dad." Traoré never knew Elijah had passed, but thousands like him, men who had seen too much and said too little, were now listening. And finally they felt heard. 1 week after the forum, something unexpected happened. The UN quietly invited Ibrahim Traoré to a closed-door session. No cameras, no press. Inside were 12 of the world's most powerful diplomats, including 2 former presidents and 1 sitting prime minister. They asked him to speak again. But this time the tone was different. He wasn't being challenged. He was being heard. Traoré walked in, not with a speech but with a memory. He spoke of the time his younger sister nearly died from malaria because there were no mosquito nets in their village. How a single net could have saved her, but no one sent one. "I was 10 years old," he said softly, "and I learned that silence can kill just as quickly as a gun." No one interrupted. Then he asked again, "What does freedom mean, if a child must die waiting for it?" The room was still. One diplomat dropped his pen. Another quietly wiped a tear. In that room, filled with suits, egos, and polished power, something fragile was unfolding. Not policy. Humanity. And for the first time, they didn't see Traoré as just an African leader. They saw him as a mirror. 2 weeks passed. The media had moved on. The headlines faded. But then, Donald Trump requested an interview. Live. No teleprompter. The world watched with curiosity, some with doubt. The interviewer leaned in. "Mr. Trump, people are still talking about your silence after President Traoré's question. Do you regret not responding?" Trump looked down for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of Traoré's quote. He read it aloud on national television. "What does freedom mean if it only exists for those who can afford it?" Then, for the first time in his public career, Donald Trump said something no one expected. "I didn't answer because I realized I didn't have one." Gasps filled the internet. But he continued. "That young man said something real, and maybe I've been wrong about what makes a nation strong." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't deflection either. It was somehow growth. And that night, people didn't cheer. They cried. Because even the loudest voice in the world had been changed by one quiet question. Back in Ouagadougou, something beautiful was happening. A small school that once had broken windows and 3 shared textbooks received a surprise grant. Not from the government, but from thousands of strangers around the world. Moved by Traoré's story, by his words, by his heart. Messages came with the donations. For the children who walk barefoot like he did. For the little girl who deserves a mosquito net. For the boy who one day might ask the next question. The school painted its gates yellow, the color of hope. On the first day of the new term, a student named Mariam stood outside the classroom, wearing her first pair of new shoes. She looked at the school's new mural, a portrait of Traoré with his quote written beneath. She didn't fully understand politics, but she understood what he had done. He'd made the world stop, just long enough for them to be seen. Inside, the teacher began roll call. Miriam raised her hand proudly. "Present," she said, "and ready." It was late. The sun had long set over Ouagadougou, and the presidential compound was nearly silent. But Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his office, staring at Elijah's letter again. Then his phone rang. It was Vanessa, Elijah's daughter. She sounded nervous but calm. "I wasn't sure I should call," she said. "But you gave my father peace. He died with purpose because of you. I needed you to know that." Traoré swallowed hard, but she wasn't finished. "He used to walk around our house angry at the world, but after your question, he smiled. He said, 'Someone finally asked what I couldn't.'" There was a long pause. "My dad didn't die for nothing. You helped him believe that." Traoré's voice broke as he whispered, "Thank you." After she hung up, he sat motionless. Then, for the first time since the Geneva Forum, he wept. But not out of pain, out of release. Because in a world full of noise, someone had finally heard him back. And in that moment, the silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. Months passed. The world kept turning. Elections were held. Wars raged. Markets crashed and climbed. But Traoré's one question kept echoing. University halls in South Africa used it as a case study. Youth protests in Berlin printed it on signs. A small cafe in Brazil painted it on its walls. What does freedom mean if it only exists for those who can afford it? It wasn't just a quote anymore. It had become a movement. Young people everywhere, from Cairo to Cape Town, from Brooklyn to Bangalore, began asking their own versions. What does justice mean if only the rich get it? What does safety mean if we fear the ones sworn to protect us? What does equality mean if some voices are always silenced? And in the center of this rising tide of truth stood one man. Not because he demanded it, but because he asked, humbly, boldly, fearlessly. Ibrahim Traoré had not given a speech. He had lit a match. And now, the world was burning with clarity. 1 year to the day after that question was asked, a global summit was held again in Geneva. But this time it was different. It wasn't about trade. It wasn't about power. It was titled simply, "The Meaning of Freedom." Traoré was invited again. So was Trump. So were youth leaders, mothers, poets, veterans, refugees. The room was full, not of politicians, but of people. And when Traoré walked in, the entire room stood. He took the podium. No notes. Then he said, "Last year, I asked a question. This year, I want to listen. Tell me, what does freedom mean to you?" One by one, voices filled the room. A child, a teacher, a farmer, a soldier's widow. They spoke through tears, through pain, through hope. And no one interrupted. No one rushed, because for the first time in a long time, the world was finally listening. If this story moved you, if you cried, if your heart whispered, "I felt that," then don't let this moment pass like just another video. Hit the like button if you believe truth still matters. Drop a comment, tell us what freedom means to you, and subscribe, because voices like Ibrahim Traoré's deserve to be heard by millions. Help us light up the world with truth, one question at a time. This isn't the end, it's the beginning.